The ancient Scots, the people of Scotland, ate kosher. They did not eat animals that are forbidden by the Bible. They only ate animals that were permitted according to the Mosaic Law, according to the law given to the Israelites when they came out of Egypt. Or, at the very least, they avoided eating swine, hare, and eel, and other animals that are prohibited by the law of Moses. And the indications are that they kept these laws, or these laws were known throughout Scotland, and that they had been kept from before the coming of Christianity to Scotland. And we believe, or we have come to the conclusion through our studies, that these practices had once prevailed throughout the British Isles, that is in what is now known as England, and also in Ireland. And the Scottish had kept them stronger than others, and they had been more true to the traditions that had anciently existed throughout Britain, and that the source of these laws is to be found in consciousness, to some degree, that they were of Israelite ancestry, and indeed they were. They were indeed of descended from Israelites. They were Hebrews. They are Hebrews. The descendants now, those who are descended from these nations, are in effect Israelites by ancestry. And they come from the 10 tribes of Israel. Originally there were 12 tribes of Israel, 12 separate tribes of Israel, and these 12 tribes split into 2 different sections. After the death of King Solomon, they split into 2 different sections. The northern kingdom was known as the Kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom was known as the Kingdom of Judah. And they existed separately, one alongside the other. Sometimes they cooperated with each other, at other times they were rivals and antagonistic to each other, fought wars against each other. And eventually the northern kingdom, which contained the majority of Israelite tribes, 10 out of the 12 tribes, was conquered by the Assyrians and taken into exile. The Bible describes this in detail. See especially 2 Kings chapter 17, where it also tells us that the lost tribes went into exile because they went in the ways of the nations around them. They worshipped their gods and followed their customs. And we trace these peoples. We can trace these peoples in the migratory paths. A section of them were taken into exile to the west almost straight away by Phoenicians and Philistine ships, or so-called Minoan ships, Minoan Greek ships, actually Philistine ships, in the employ of the Assyrians, took them to the west, where some of them settled in Spain, and from there they moved into Gaul, and afterwards to Ireland and into Britain. Others, the majority of them, had been of the Israelite exiles, taken overland into what is now Mesopotamia, into the Syrian Empire, the cities of the Medes, and so on, as the Bible describes. And there they became identified with, or they linked up with, became part of the confederation of peoples known as the Cimmerians, the Scythians, and the Guti or Goths. And these peoples moved to the north, moved into now what was now southern Russia and the environment and the surrounding regions. From there, progressively they moved westward. And nearly all of them moved to the west, and they congregated in the western areas of Europe. And they also reached the British Isles, reaching the areas of Ireland and Scotland and England. And this is what we have proven. We have proven this. We research this. We propagate the knowledge of it. We bring proofs from the Bible, from rabbinical sources, from secular sources, from history, archaeology, legends, linguistics, and from every available source we can find. We find a lot of evidence concerning this, and this is what we work out. Our organisation, Britain Hebrew Nations, dedicates itself to researching these facts, this truth, and spreading knowledge of it, and also working towards reconciliation between the lost 10 tribes, who are descendants of the lost 10 tribes, and the Jewish people. My name is Yair Davidi. I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. I'm speaking to the headquarters of Brit and Hebrew Nations in Jerusalem. And this talk concerns the Scottish, or how in Scotland they once kept the laws of kosher, as if to say. As we said, the 10 tribes, portion of the 10 tribes had been associated with the Scythians, and the Scythians eventually moved to the west. And Herodotus, a very early Greek historian, about 450 BCE, before the Common Era, 450 years before the Common Era, he tells us that the Scythians, and in aversion to swine, he says, I quote from him, see Herodotus, volume 3, book 4, section 63, such are the observances of the Scythians with respect to sacrifice. They never used swine for their purpose, nor indeed it is their want to breed them in any part of their country. They did not use swine, they did not breed swine. They kept away from swine. And a portion of the Scythians eventually gave rise, or migrated. All of the Scythians migrated to the west in different stages. The last sections of them comprised the Anglo-Saxons and related nations. Also, the Khazars was also part of the Scythian nations. Before then, before that time, sections of them had also split off and had gone westward, where they had joined up with the Celtic people of Celtic culture, and they had reached Scotland. And the Scots had and so did the Irish, or at least a portion of them, had a tradition that they were descended from Scythians. And the Scottish and the English were always fighting with each other. England was trying to conquer Scotland. The Scottish were raiding England and allying themselves with the enemies of the English, as if to say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so the English and the Scottish, until they eventually joined together, were at odds and ends with each other. So at one stage, after the Scottish had beaten off an attempt by the English to conquer them, in 1320 CE, they came out with what's known as the Declaration of Arbroath. I hope I pronounced it right. This was actually a form in the of a letter to the Pope declaring their independence. And in this declaration, they say, amongst other things, that we know from the chronicles and books of the ancients, we find that amongst other famous nations, our own the Scots has been graced with widespread renown. They journeyed from the greater Scythia by way of the Tyrrhenian Sea and the Pillars of Hercules, and worked for a long course of time in Spain among the most savage tribes. But nowhere could they be subdued by any race, however barbarous. And as they came 1200 years after the people of Israel crossed the Red Sea to the home in the west where they still live today. So in other words, in this Declaration of Independence, which is a very important document, one of the most important documents in Scottish history, and some say, this Declaration of Arbroath, in its principles that it enunciates, actually contains much that has also become important to the USA history, principles that were later embodied in the US Constitution and in US constitutional principles and jurisprudence and law and traditions, of representative, responsible representation emanating from the people, government emanating from the people, being responsible to the people, is to be found in this declaration. So it is quite an important document, and in this document the people of Scotland declare their origination, or their having come from the Scythians. And this is possibly true to some degree, because the inhabitants of Scotland are actually a mixture of different peoples, as are all inhabitants of the British Isles. Different nations, different tribes, and so on settled in Scotland. Part of those who settled in Scotland came from Ireland. They were known as the Scoti. That is where the name Scotland comes from a people who actually, before they came to Scotland, the last place they were was in Ireland, the Scoti. They're also known as the Milesians and the Iberians, and they conquered Western Scotland, and they gave their name to Scotland. And they too had their own traditions, of Israelite origins, or Israelite having once kept Israelite customs. There's a Louis Hyman, who was once a judge in Ireland. He's of Jewish origin. He wrote a book, The Jews of Ireland, and he apparently studied the subject well. And on page 1 of his book, The Jews of Ireland, published in 1972, he says, it is stated in very old copies of the Book of Invasions and other ancient documents that it was the Mosaic Law that the Milesians brought into Erin, and this into Ireland, that their coming that had been learned and received from Moses in Egypt by Cain Beathach, who was himself an Israelite, but had been sent into Egypt to learn the language of their country by the great master Phineas Farsaith, from whom the Milesian brothers who conquered Erin are recorded to have been the 22nd generation in descent, and it is said that in the preference to Seneca's more, this was the law of Erin at the time of the coming of St. Patrick. So in effect, according to these sources, they are saying that the Milesians were descended from Israelites and they had once kept the laws of Moses. And these were the people who gave Scotland its name and were an important element in the ethnic constitution of the Scottish people. They're also known, the Milesians are known as Milesians in Irish tradition, also known as Hibernia and as Scotty, and they gave their name to Scotland. And they may have been the origin of the prohibitions, certain food prohibitions against pork and other animals, as we shall see, or what is more likely, what seems more likely according to the sources, these prohibitions already existed, and they seem to have existed throughout Scotland, throughout the Highlanders, throughout the Highlands and the Lowlands, and to have been there for quite some time. They were not kept all over Scotland all the time, but they were known throughout the country. And the impression is that they were known of, and there were periods when they were enforced or widely practiced in some areas until very recently. These prohibitions prevailed, until by recently, I mean within historical times, within a couple of 100 years ago, these prohibitions were still enforced and they had existed from before Scotland being converted to Christianity. And these traditions are concomitant with, found together with the notion of the belief of Israelite descent. And Donald A. Mackenzie, in his Scottish Folklore and Folk Life Studies and Race Culture and Traditions, published in the UK in 1935, Chapter 1 gives us a lot of sources concerning these traditions of the Scottish having kept biblical food laws. He says that the aversion against eating pig existed amongst both Highlanders and Lowlanders. There's still thousands of Highlanders and groups of Lowlanders who refuse to keep pigs or to partake of their flesh. He also says that in northeast England bordering Scotland, the fishermen dislike reference being made to the pig in connection with their work. The pig is considered to bring bad luck. Also quotes from Sir Walter Scott in The Fortunes of Nigel, one of the works of Sir Walter Scott, the famous novelist. He said he quotes him and he puts in the mouth of a Scottish character concerning saying that Sir Mungo cannot abide pork, no more than the King's most sacred majesty or my Lord Duke Lennox nor Lord Dalgan of the Scots never eat pork. Strange that, some folk think they are a sort of Jew. And he also says that the Scots, that is the Lowlanders, till within the last generation dislike swine's flesh as an article of food as much as the Highlanders do at present. Also, Sir Walter Scott, in his story, The True Drovers, gives an account of execration, of a cursing in Gaelic of a Highlander, cursing some Englishmen who had been ridiculing him, and he says 100 curses on the swine eaters who know neither decency nor civility. We see from this anecdote that eating swine, eating pig's flesh, in the eyes of a Scotsman was considered contemptible, something to be disparaged, something that the English did. It was something that true Scotsmen would not do, and this is what we find throughout the sources. And James VI of Scotland, who later became James I of England, and he was responsible for the unification of England and Scotland and the creation of Great Britain, and he did not eat pig. He hated pork in all its varieties. He would not allow it on his table. Later there was a civil war in England where the Roundheads under Cromwell fought against the Royalists supporting the King, the Scots were involved. They were involved in several ways. They were involved in both sides, and not only were they involved in both sides, but they changed sides, so it was quite confused who was fighting against who. At all events, the Scots were involved in this, and they fought against Cromwell's forces several times, and they were defeated. And so, at one stage, the English side, who had celebrating their victory, they had a song. The song recalls the Jewish Scots scorns to eat the flesh of swine and brewers and meat. 'Twas the sight of this hogshead made them retreat, which nobody can deny. In other words, the song was associating the people of Scotland with the Jews, and they were referring to their aversion to their dislike of eating pork meat, because pork meat was not something that the Scotsmen did. It was not something that was acceptable. G. Dalziel in 1691 says, "Why do Scotchmen hate swine's flesh? And I borrow it of the Jews." And I have another source that tells us that swine were avoided in Scotland, throughout Scotland. And a certain Captain Burt, on duty in Scotland in 1730, wrote, "Pork is not very common amongst us. I've often heard the Scots will not eat it. It's a general notion that where the chief declares against pork, his followers affect to show the same dislike." And Dr. Johnson tells us that the inhabitants of Skye and not only have eels, but pork and bacon in abhorrence. They abhor them. And he says, "I never saw a hog in the Hebrides except one." Reverend L. Grant in 1793 says, "The deep prejudice against swine's flesh is now removed." In other words, he says in his time, in the 1790s, towards the early 19th century, this taboo, the prohibition against eating swine's flesh, had begun to become weakened, and more and more Scots people were doing it. But but in the past it had been well known and had been strongly followed. And this is also referred to by John Tolland in 1714, and John Tolland not only refers to this practice and other of the Scotsmen not eating swine's flesh, but also keeping other biblical practices. He also suggested that the origin of this might be due to when the English expelled the Jews in 1290, that many of them having fled to Scotland and been assimilated amongst the Scotsmen. But there's no historical records of this, but who knows? He says, "You know how considerable a part of the British inhabitants are the undoubted offspring of the Jews, and how many were the prelates, that is, churchmen of the same stock, and not to speak of lords and commoners, may at this time make an illustrious figure amongst us. A great number of them fled to Scotland, which is the reason so many in that part of the island have a remarkable aversion to pork and back puddings to this day, not to insist on some other resemblances easily observable." See from this that the biblical taboos existed throughout Scotland, and they were associated with the Jews, and other different explanations have been given as to where these taboos came from, what was their originates, what gave rise to them, and all the explanations, and none of them really satisfactory. And the best explanation is that these people had tradition passed on from their ancestors, that certain foods, certain animals were forbidden to be eaten, and that these animals were forbidden by the Bible, by the Hebrew Bible, and that Hebrews do not eat them. And since the Scottish people were Hebrews, they should not eat them. The name of Scot, according to one explanation, means wanderer, which is also synonymous with the term Hebrew. We will discuss this on another talk. So we see from all this that the Scots people did not like eating, not only didn't like, they considered it forbidden to eat pork and to eat eels. And there are references or suggestions that such prohibitions had in effect once prevailed throughout the British Isles, throughout England, but it's now England and Wales and Ireland, and in Scotland, and also as well as in Scotland. In Scotland they had kept because maybe they have a Scottish character, more stubborn, more traditional, and were less influenced by outside forces, and they maybe have more of a natural bent inclination towards biblical practices. The older forms of Presbyterianism was very similar in its thought processes to those of rabbinical Judaism. Even now, though nowadays they have departed from this and they have degenerated greatly, and now they are also, not only have they degenerated greatly in the applications of the Bible and their appreciation for the Bible, but now they are leading a campaign against the state of Israel, and or some of them are involved in a campaign against the state of Israel, and they are bringing disgrace upon the Scottish people. By all events, we find a source that the hair was taboo in ancient Britain, according to Julius Caesar. He mentions that the native Britons did not eat the hair, and now we find in Western Brittany in France, that part of the western part of France, which had been settled by people from Britain who were fleeing from the Anglo-Saxon invasions, or were pushed out due to the Anglo-Saxon invasions. In other words, descendants of their native inhabitants. They also considered the hair to be forbidden. And so we see that there was such practices amongst other inhabitants of the British Isles, and these practices are associated with Israelites. They're associated with Israelite ancestry, and the inhabitants of the British Isles and of related areas over the seas in Western Europe are also descendants of Israelites, and the Israelites eventually founded the nations of Canada, the USA, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and they are the forces of Joseph. They are the descendants of Joseph, along with other tribes, other Israelite tribes amongst them, and these traditions that they kept, or that they once observed, or that were observed amongst them, show that they were of Israelite origin, or give additional proofs alongside the hundreds of different facts and points of evidence that we have showing that they were indeed descended from the Hebrews. And we should take note of this, and we should put it to our heart, and we should also learn about this, learn more about it, and help spread the information concerning it. May the Lord the God of Israel bless all of you and be with you. This is Yair Davidi. I've been speaking to you on behalf of Brit and Hebrew nations, and I've been speaking to you from Jerusalem.